All right. So I'm recording this immediately after the introduction, right? So I didn't change shirts. I'm not a lunatic. Um, I'm not putting that much effort into it. It always blows my mind when I see these shows that someone will try to be that consistent, and they're like, I'm going to have the perfect light, and I'm going to have this. And the funny thing about that is I think that the most hilarious thing about podcasts trying to emulate newscasts to me was that I thought the whole point of the podcast culture was like sort of to push back against that. It's so hilarious to me. I watch a lot of these, obviously, but like you watch obviously, it's a hot topic, but you watch a Joe Rogan or you watch, I really like to watch a lot of these fringe ones, not because I believe it, but because it's interesting. And it's funny to me how a lot of them are sort of like, we're the counterculture, but then they will sort of emulate each other, and it'll all go back. I mean, you watch CNN and watch sort of these like cross talks and all this other stuff, and it's so similar from their medium to our medium. And I'm saying ours if I'm a part of this collective, which I'm not. I just don't see how that's helpful, right? I don't give a damn about looking like, I'm a professional at this. I'm not, and I don't want to be. This is not my profession, right? I've said it before, my profession, I'm an educator. I have a bachelor's degree in history. I've begun work on my master's degree. And the area which I am most interested in is, first of all, it's hard to define, but the area I'm most interested in is sort of this relationship between granular change and sort of the larger scale changes that come from it. And so I have a tendency to hyper focus on little things and then try to extrapolate them to big things. So at once I'm trying to have the 3,000 foot view, and at the same time try to be have the perspective of the ant. This is very hard to do because a lot of the middle ground is sort of the chaos of trying to figure out how cultural viewpoints, laws, historical precedents, all customs, things like that, how all those things affect the interpretation of the granular aspect on the way up to the 3,000 foot view, right? Because a 3,000 foot view is something people say a lot, but what I think you have to realize is that the 3,000 foot view is one that has to inherently encapsulate all of the different interpretations of this minute data. So, of course, my struggle is that I'm a single person and there's only so many viewpoints I can hold. And I'm also a person that's lived a certain way and had certain experiences. So certain viewpoints I will see and I'll just sort of write off, which isn't good. You want to be as objective as possible. True objectivity is an illusion, right? It's like trying to say you're going to find the one fundamental fact of all things, right? It really matters about who you're speaking to. Objectivity differs, and you can say, oh, it doesn't. There's a scientific interpretation of objectivity. Right. I'm not a math problem. As much as we would like to reduce ourselves, sometimes I find this reductivism or positivism puts people in what I like to call the calculator's trap, which is that essentially the trap of the calculator is that you can figure out, say I'm having the worst day ever. My girlfriend broke up with me. I'm in the middle of doing a calculus problem and I can punch in the digits and I can figure out a formula. But no matter how many times I punch in those digits and no matter how many times I figure out a formula, even if the formula is for why we broke up, the person typing in the calculator is inherently separate from the proof. And I'm experiencing all the different things, all the different influences of my life as I type that proof in. And the calculator's trap is that you think a solution that shows up in that bar is going to somehow resolve all of these problems that you have inherently been building for yourself. And it's the idea that somehow math as a fundamental, if you're a polymath and you see the world through the view of a polymath, great. But if you don't, then having these finite solutions really becomes something that's, it's almost like it's an illusion. It's an oasis in the desert, but it's not going to help you, right? And it's just the way it is. Some people's minds are different than others, And so let's get away from the idea that I'm here to prove some objective truth and that I believe that I can, right? As a historian, you want to believe you can. But I just think that it is folly, and I'm not interested in folly. Like it's not that I'm not interested because I won't be a part of it. I'm not interested because I'm inherently a part of it, and therefore I don't need to have much interest in it because I'm going to do it anyway, right? It'll produce its own self-seeking interests. I don't need to foster that. Folly will have its own engine, and it will pull me in whether I want to or not. There's no escaping it. So I don't need to feed it any more than already it is fed by my own ridiculous life. So, and this is what I mean by the rambling nature of myself. I tend to kind of do that where I'll take something and sort of walk down the road a little bit with it. If you're looking for something that's perfectly structured, you're in the wrong place, right? Like if you could see my desk right now, it's just an assortment of drawings and pens and, pencil sharpeners and random things. I'm not here to present to you some perfect medium of information, right? That in itself obfuscates the reality. That in itself is part of the delusion, right? This is why so many people believe these podcasters. I think it's one of the great problems with it is that they present this professional image, and that's very manipulative, right? Anybody can go buy a perfect light and a perfect tripod and get the system and get your mics. And once you do that, people really start to believe for some reason that you're legitimate, right? This is sort of the fallacy that I could open up a mechanic shop and have all the tools in there and not know shit about how to work on a car, right? But people would bring me their cars because the presentation would suggest that I know, because people would say, well, why would somebody waste money building up a mechanic shop if they aren't actually a mechanic? Well, because they're trying to swindle you, right? That's the charlatan. That's the snake oil salesman, right? It's the person that realizes that there is an easily manipulated base. People can't help it. They're looking for shortcuts in logic, and they're shortcut in logic. And sometimes it's true. Say 95% of the time it's true. You go to the bakery because they have all the things and they have the most up-to-date equipment, and you go there and they have the best baked goods you've ever had. But we've all had that experience where you go to a place that seems legit and you walk out and you're thinking to yourself, like, that was really terrible. Like, I don't know why they spent all that money. They're garbage, right? And so this is sort of an incongruency that we have to deal with right out of the gate, right? And I'm not trying to feed into that. I'm not a professional. I'm not a newscaster. I don't watch the news often. I really prefer people who just keep it real in the sense of like, they are not trying to sell you that there's something they're not. I can tell you that I have a degree, and there will be people who know things I don't know, right? And I'm willing to learn from anybody. But having a degree in Florida may look different to having a degree in New York or wherever, And so I think that people have to understand that even that in itself is something you could present to give people a false sense of confidence. The only way you're going to be able to gain confidence in what I'm saying is if you watch. And if you don't watch, then that's fine. But that's the only real way to gain confidence in what I'm saying. And through the experience of this with me. And that's what I'm interested in, an actual dialogue. As if we're talking, we're two friends at a coffee shop. And you could decide whether Matt's full of shit or whether or not I am, speaking some truth in this moment. And the truth is, it's probably going to be equal parts, right? It's equal parts. It can't all be gold, and I'm not trying to sell you on the fact that it is, okay? I just want to establish that. I think I've defended that enough, but I just want to say that because that is the disclaimer for all disclaimers. I'm not going to go into this again. If you want to go back 10 years from now, I'm still making this show, and somebody says, oh, well, this guy said this, and it was wrong, and he's presenting himself as an authority. I'm not presenting myself as an authority, okay? I'm not. On anything. I use thrift books to buy cheap books. I read the books. I have an issue with marginalia, which is where you write in the text, right? So I read Time and Free Will by Henri Bergson, struggled with it. The man speaks in almost another language, despite it being English, but you can see, right? I have this tendency to write in the margins and underline You'll never want to let me borrow a book. I can't help it. It'll happen anyway. I've given back books. This is why I don't check out books from the library, right? Because I will massacre them with my own thoughts. And the thoughts may be relative to what I'm reading, right? There's enough examples, right? Anyway, so the point being, I want you to understand, I have my phone propped up against a carving of a bear, and it's being held at its base by a Lyra vinyl eraser. So I'm not even buying the tripod. I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. So anyway, I think we've belabored enough on that. Again, the format of this, I don't know how long. Some will be 10 minutes, some will be 15 minutes, some will be an hour. I don't know. It's up to you to continue watching if you want to. I'm never going to try to monetize this. It does me no good. I say never. If I land some sweetheart deal and I'm making money doing this, I still don't see any way that I would be willing to monetize. Like, I'm never going to do a commercial of Blue Chew Gold, which, let me tell you, I don't know why I get these this much. Maybe it's because I'm a guy in his 40s, but like, the algorithm has decided that I need to see people talking about Blue Chew Gold. That's a different tangent, but I'm just going to tell you, Blue Chew Gold. If you're watching this, I don't need any of that stuff. Okay, I'm not interested. I'm completely fine degrading and turning into a useless pile of slop. I don't need that. Okay, so please stop. And I don't know that most guys do. 41, it's just, hey man, we've had the experience. We don't need you to drag us through the mud and to keep telling us that we need to keep having this experience. I have different interests, okay? Sat outside watching birds this morning. So what do we want to talk about today now that we've gotten through our initial, and that'll probably be how this happens, okay? I want you to understand something about me. I have to unpack my brain a little bit. There's so much random stuff going on up there. Sometimes the introductory ramble is probably going to be the best way for me to really kind of get into my zone of talking about a subject. So you'll have to forgive me. Again, if it's a format you don't like, you could probably skip through the first few minutes, right? I'm not going to give you a cue or something like that, but I'll probably, fall into a rhythm within the first couple minutes. But yeah, so that's going to be kind of how this works. So one of the things I will say, consistency, I'll probably try to record from this angle and have a candle or something. There has to be something ritualistic, right? There has to be some ritual in order for this to feel that I'm going to a place and doing something I don't normally do so I can tap into something else. So I'm going to try to do that, right? But if the candle's not there, it just means that I don't have a candle, right? Because I like expensive candles. Well, they're not super expensive, but I really like Sydney candle. You ever seen these, Sydney? Brilliant little company. Great candles. I'm burning warm woods right now, which smells like you would imagine. Warm woods. Okay. It's like an autumnal flavor. Flavor, scent. I think it's a flavor. I think that's what you would call it. I mean, scents would be good, but I think a flavor works. Anyway, so what do we want to talk about in this first episode now that we're ready to kind of get into it? What I wanted to talk about a little bit is about sort of the idea that Plato's Republic is a satire. Now, I know this is something that's divisive. Some people say it isn't. Some people say it is. But I think that you have to be willing to consider that the whole dialogue in Republic is satirical. It's the idea, because you can feel the ironies being baked into it as it goes, right? It feels very Flannery O'Connor-ish, where it's sort of giving you this perfect state only so you can see it fail. So the great irony that's baked into the Republic as they sort of try to devise, as he with Adamantus and Polymarchus and all these try to devise this perfect concept of a state, which, by the way, is only being constructed because they're trying to define what justice is, right? The original conversation where they're talking about what's just and unjust, and are the unjust more happy than the just, etc. Socrates realizes in that dialogue that he hasn't really even addressed what is justice. And the only way to do that, it would be to create a perfect society in which the actions of those perfect people would be definable as just or unjust. And you would know that they were just because there would be figments personalities, types of people in that society that were generally constructed and molded to be nothing but that. In this case, it's the guardians, as it were. Because they've already decided ahead of time. You have to realize the concept here of justice is not necessarily what we would think about in the legal system, right? It's the concept of somebody doing something that doesn't necessarily benefit them, right? It's not a beneficial thing to them. It's about doing something that is beneficial to all, even at their own detriment. They even say, Socrates even says, the most just person, if a person was just to a fault, their life would be full of agony and suffering, and essentially they would have to go to their death, turning the other cheek, never having revenge, never taking care of themselves, and letting every single unjust person take advantage of them. That's a good thing to keep in mind when you think about the pretext of the story of Jesus, right? I'm not a very, I grew up in the Christian house, and I've read the Bible front to back, right? And I'm the kind of person that I always question things, and inherently I question anybody who doesn't see the Bible as allegory. But the story of Jesus is strange in the Bible, right? It's this weird biography in the middle of the whole thing. But one of the things that's strange about it, if you understand the conversations that are going on with Socrates and during this concept of the just and unjust, you'll realize, first of all, this happened hundreds of years before Jesus came along, right? Secondly, you'll realize that the person they're describing, the most just man, literally ends up being the exact ethos of what Jesus later is. Now, you could infer a few different things from that. If you're not a religious person and have the proclivity or have the tendency to believe that Jesus was not magical and all these other things and wasn't ordained and divine, then your thought process might be, well, maybe he read this because he did travel to Greece and stuff. Maybe he understood and had read these texts, and so he took it upon himself to sort of say, well, I'm going to be this incredibly just person, and I'm going to live that way. And you could see that if he followed the guideline that they laid down, then he would end up in the exact scenario that he did, right? On the other hand, you could say that Socrates sort of predicted that this person would come along, and that this person, if you assume that Jesus was a divine entity, that basically Socrates was able to predict that this is what that would look like. And he does look like that. And that, and again, there's questions there. They rub against each other in interesting ways. If you're a really religious person and you have a life view that you're trying to support and instantiate that, and you're trying to constantly substantiate the validity of your religious belief in life, this is going to be a great way for you to do so. The Western logic that we apply to so many things, the Socratic logic, completely justifies and completely substantiates what your belief is, right? If on the other hand, you're a person who's trying to refute it, you have fuel for that too, where you can say, well, he was just copying something that he saw, and this was a rhetoric that existed, right? To be honest, I have no interest in either. I think both are viable. It depends on what you want. My life view is not one that excludes religion or includes it in overt ways. It sort of seeps in and out in a fluid way. I have religious connotations to certain things because they feel like that. I have sometimes I studied physics very, very ardently whenever I was, or fervently, I should say. Whenever I was young, I was obsessed with it. I wanted to be a physicist. Math got in the way. I just don't love math. The idea of doing math all the time just really was a pain beyond death to me. So I walked away from it, but I was always able to really understand the large scale level theories, right? I was able to understand the high level theories, and my creativity does lend itself to these sort of quantum systems. They make a lot of sense to me. And we'll have a talk later about some concepts I have about, structure of the universe and things that I've just thought of. But one of the things that I find is that it doesn't do me any good to completely exclude religious logic. Not because I have some need for it necessarily to help bail me out in moments where I'm feeling like life is scary, but because there is information tied up in groups that are exclusively religious. And if I'm not going to include them in my body of knowledge, I'm going to inherently have a one-sided perspective, and I don't want that. It's pointless to me, right? So whereas a Socrates is religious in the sense of understanding that religion is part of the order of civilization and of all reality, right? There's a hierarchical order, and at the top is God, and then down from there. For him, it's a structural mechanism. But, for the person where it's deeper than that, and it's actually something that is a sort of empathic, connective mechanism where they need it to sort of interact with things, that's not the kind of religious person that Socrates is. So I think it depends on the personality that's at play here. But the idea that I can't learn anything from St. Thomas of Aquinas, even though that's his logic base, but that to me I'm not willing to exclude him, even if he was devoutly religious, right? You could see brilliance in the logic of like a Martin Luther or something like that, even though it's based around religion. So let's go ahead and get that out of the way. I'm not choosing one side or the other. Sort of the randomness of this podcast. The trash guy is here right now. Hold on, let's listen. Listen, I've crammed that thing so full of cardboard boxes, I don't think it's going to come out. If I go out there later and it's still full, I won't be shocked. I question whether or not there was going to be too much friction for it to come out, but here we are. Anyway, so in reading Socrates, he's talking about justice, so we've got it out of the way. Socrates is a person that understands religious to be an ordering reality, an ordering structure of reality, right? Well, there's a God, there's the gods, there's the role of humanity, but that people inherently are in charge of people. And that God, in his view, is sort of the top of the chain and sort of a creative mechanism, but not really dealing with the day-to-day, right? They use God Socrates uses God sort of as a construct where, in his mind, even logically, he reduces God to something that is essentially benign. If it's ultimately just, it can't act for good or bad. It has to sort of just exist in this benign state. And so therefore, God is not this active agent that's promoting good or evil. That's all the composite range of human behavior. And so that's where Socrates falls on the matter. Now, interestingly, when he comes back to the idea, this is where the concept of justice comes from. Well, then if humans are the only ones that can be truly just because we can't really value or measure the actions of God, then what does it mean to be just? Because the conversation comes about that being just has no value, right? If you know you can be unjust and you'll have a happier life, you'll be wealthier, you'll have the things you want, you can get them easier than if you weren't. What is the point in being just? Is there any value in it? And Socrates takes this upon himself. Now, I don't believe deep down that Socrates actually believes that there's value in being just. I just think Socrates was a person who loved dealing with query. Right? And if Socrates was a person, Plato, whoever you want it to be. So, but the idea here is that we want to engage in questions. And if we say that something's absolutely not true, then even better, right? That's the thing, right? It's just, let's see if we can find a logic to dispel things. Because ultimately, I think the goal of Plato is to raise the idea and to put forth the idea, and I'm not the first to say this, but it's to put forth the idea that all things are inherently negotiable based on the logic set that you're applying. So logic, mathematical logic or historical logic or religious logic, whatever system you put it into, there's going to be bias because that system is inherently a bias, right? Without bias, you have no metric, right? If I don't have a context, which is my bias, then I don't have a metric for understanding anything. And for those who say, well, you can have pure understanding and just science, you don't need to have human this and that, there are fundamental this and that, blah, 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 it all comes down to math. Listen, okay, we get it. You're smart, but you're also delusional. You cannot exclude yourself from any logic set, right? Jung kind of put this forward. You don't understand. The person who tells themselves that they're completely excluding their own viewpoint does not understand how deeply those things run. It's impossible. It's impossible. And not only impossible, it's impractical. If you could completely review your viewpoint and your bias from every single thing, you would have no interests. You would have no desire to feed yourself. You would essentially die. You would have nothing that propelled you forward, right? And there'll be those that argue that, oh, that's not true. You can do this. The best you can do is attempt it. And hey, you could say that's a noble effort. Personally, I don't understand why that has any nobility to it. To me, it's just a fact that they are still being biased. And their bias is that this logic set is the most irrefutable and gives himself primacy in the argument, right? So if I can be deeply mathematically logic, I can say that that's removed from all human construct and bias and context. And in so doing, I can elevate myself above whoever I'm having discourse with, right? Can we see this? This is a structural bias. This not only is a structural bias, but I would say it also has the pollutant of having a superiority and inferiority complex. Adler would chew this to pieces, right? So we're going to go ahead and get away from that. I have no interest in that. I find the people that believe deeply that they've somehow removed themselves from the fray of human bias to be completely honest, to be insufferable. I cannot stand this kind of person. At times, Sam Harris falls into this, where he's like almost talking from a high perch, which is hilarious. He's still a human in a black sweater. It's like, dude, like just get off your high horse. Nobody's there. Nobody's there, right? I'm not there. Nobody's there. So let's stop the pretending. Hot take, right? And that's not to say I don't like Sam Harris. I like Sam Harris. I think he's a brilliant man. But there's no way that dude's not propelled by a little bit of his own helium. You know what I'm saying? He's sucking down his own fumes. So, but to the point of Socrates, he's really good at sort of removing himself from moving what he would think would be good or bad, right? He's good at sort of being like, well, what is the question? And can we see both sides of it? Now, inherently, the questions he's asking are important to him, right? This is the biggest issue with having no bias, right? Well, the only questions you're going to ask are things you're interested in. That's a bias, right? That's a context you can't remove. Why is that a question that you care about in the first place, right? Now, I do give Socrates and Plato credit because the way that they go about it is at least in a way that appears to be sincere, right? They're trying to entertain this idea that you can deduce what is just and unjust by going through this methodological approach with logic where you go step by step and you break things down and you have a group that you're talking to and you all are having agreed upon ideas. Right? One of the big flaws in the Socrates text is that the people he's talking to in this in the Republic are essentially just yes men, right? There's not a lot of dissent. And so that sort of is one of the flaws in the writing, but we got to give him a break. You know, this is 400 BC, somewhere around there. I don't know the exact date, but it was a while ago. So their narrative structure there is good, but you have to imagine this is a very early type of writing, and it does take time to get used to this. Now, one of the things, 28 minutes, one of the things that I think is important to understand about the Republic's concept of justice is that it becomes fairly obvious as they're describing what the perfect society would be that they're stepping on their own toes. And if you're reading it closely and not listening on an audiobook, okay, I'm sorry, but you cannot listen to Republic on an audiobook. It just is, you're not going to be able to study the text properly. A, because some of the ways he words things is difficult to understand because of the difference in vernacular at the time. And B, because nobody can do a deep study on audiobook. I'm sorry. It's not possible. I tried listening to Adler on audiobook and I literally just walked away being like, I'm going to have to go read that now. I have no idea what I was listening to. So the idea that you have to be actively involved with Socrates is intentional. He's actively involved in the discussion. It's a prohibitively dense conversation, and he's not trying to make this accessible to just the layman, right? He's not. This is why, because he talks about the layman as being sort of not a group. He's speaking for them because he doesn't think they're going to speak for themselves. if you look at the group that he's talking to, these are not laymen, right? These are people who are in a position to where they are, at least in their own mind, extruded enough from society to where they can sort of reflect on aspects of it. And so they talk about each compartment, whether it be the skilled layman, whether it be the religious, whether it be the guards, etc. What they hit upon is the idea that justice is basically in the domain of those who protect people, right? And the people who protect people the most would be the guardians. And the guardians, in this sense, have a sort of military backing, but what they do in this conversation, and it's very interesting, is they sort of set up the basis for the people that should be governing societies. Now, it's important to know this because the forefathers of the United States clearly were obsessed with this, and not them alone. I mean, you can tell this text, this specific part in the building of the Republic has shaped so much of nation-making since it came through, right? Since it was published. And it's definitely since Enlightenment. Like, it is just this huge concept that has been a weight on society, which is that there should be a group of people who are raised from the time they're born and exposed to specific types of things, whether it be literature, music, gymnastic, all these other things. And to be fair, their definition of music and gymnastic is broad. They basically include that everything in society falls under one of these two categories. So you can't just assume that they're meaning working out and listening to music. Music to them includes literature and all kinds of other things. Anything that requires rhythm and grace, etc., falls under the music. And gymnastic is sort of the physicality of that. And that's a very, very, very crude simplification, but I'm not going to have time to break that down for you. That would have to be a completely different conversation. And we could talk about whether or not their views are valid. But in his own mind, he has broken down societal action into music and gymnastics, right? So in his mind, though, the perfect guardian would be somebody who is raised to listen to only a specific kind of music and be educated in a specific kind of text. You would not have somebody who is provided with dissenting views. You would not have people who were willfully moving away from the very strict definitions of what music should be or what gymnastics should be. And so inherently what they're providing is that the most just person, the guardian, would be a person who from the time they were born is essentially a robot. They're programmed to exist within a specific, non-negotiable metric of content. Right? Your music is a certain type of music. It doesn't include anything that goes outside of this definition. Your gymnastic and your physical experience is the same. It exists within a certain reason, and it only exists because it is a sort of means to an end. So they even say the person that works out all the time but has no music sort of becomes this crude barbarian of a type. And in this sense, it's like a person who's not literate, who doesn't spend time reading poetry but works out all the time, will end up becoming sort of this angry, violent, grousing, sort of, aggressive personality. And I think we can all attest that that's true.